Good morning, everybody. Can everybody hear me? Need to get started. I am Pietro Nivola, the director of the Governance Studies Department here at Brookings, and I welcome you to our annual tradition of kibitzing a little bit in the wake of the State of the Union address, which is always fun because it also gives us a chance to kind of take stock of where the nation stands at the beginning of each year for our own purposes, as well as for commenting on what the President said last night. We have a very good panel here, and although I'm sad to say that Audrey Singer, who is going to discuss immigration policy with us, has a bad cold, which we dodged, thank God, and she won't be joining us. But let me go down the across here. Carlos Pascual is the director of the Foreign Policy Program. He's really one of the most thoughtful and experienced foreign policy experts this institution has ever had. And he'll be talking about the foreign relations, foreign affairs aspects of the session. Bill Frenzel, a former congressman. You were on Ways and Means years ago, right, Bill? Well, Bill goes way back, 30 or 40 years. And is also an expert on just about everything, including energy policy. He can attest to the fact that this is one of the more circular, repetitive debates this country's ever had. I can't think of another one more like that, except maybe for the tariff in the 19th century. So he'll talk on a number of domestic issues. To my left is my dear friend and colleague, Bill Galston, who's a senior fellow in governance studies, and he'll talk about a number of domestic issues as well as commenting on some foreign policy questions. David Sandalow is our resident expert on energy and environmental questions, and he'll treat that aspect of the program in detail today. Let me start with Carlos. Carlos, did you the speech last night was really more about domestic issues than foreign policy, in the sense that the President devoted a great deal of time to the domestic side, perhaps trying to change the conversation a little bit from the Iraq predicament. But still, the Iraq component and the war on terror and the usual themes were very much part of that speech. I guess, did you sense anything different? Was there anything novel? Did the President acquit himself in some sense better or differently than he did 2 weeks ago? I wonder if you could talk about that. Furthermore, he did touch on some other international questions of considerable significance, Iran, North Korean problem. He spoke about the intensive diplomacy that's going on there, but he seemed to downplay those types of issues, and he certainly downplayed the Russian role in blackmailing various countries with the energy card. One of the more interesting things in the speech that probably isn't going to get that much attention was the huge increase in foreign aid for combating HIV/AIDS, malaria, the Millennium Challenge account, and so on. And I wonder if you want to say something about that too, but generally comment on the foreign policy part of the speech.
Good. Pietro, thank you. What I would say is, from a foreign policy perspective, this was not really a statement on the State of the Union or a way forward on international security issues. And I think it failed to address the systemic and structural security challenges that we face today, that it failed to address convincingly some of the critical crises in which we face ourselves, including Iraq, which was really a repetition of the previous week's speech, the Middle East peace process, Iran, North Korea, Lebanon, or Darfur. There were lines on each of those issues, but really no strategy that was put forward with any of those. It really ignored as well his own promise of bipartisanship, where he indicated at the beginning that there's a quote, a willingness to cross that aisle when there's work to be done. But in Iraq, he basically reiterated, my way is the only way to go forward. Let me come back to a couple of these points. On the systemic questions, let me illustrate this with two paradoxes. We have the strongest military that we've ever seen in history. We have a nuclear arsenal that can destroy any country in the world. Yet at the same time, our military capability has not been able to achieve our objectives in Iraq or Afghanistan. We have not been able to preclude Iran or North Korea from gaining a nuclear capability or being well on the way toward gaining that capability. Terrorism has spread around the world, and the United States is probably the most condemned that we have seen in recent history. In a poll that was released by the BBC yesterday of 25 countries throughout the world, in 19 of those 25 countries it says that the U.S. has a negative influence on how we're handling Iraq, Lebanon, Iran, North Korea, Guantanamo, and climate change. From a different perspective, this has been accused of being one of the most unilateralist administrations we have ever seen. Yet at the same time, this administration has had to come back to the United Nations for some form of help, whether it's through forces, legitimacy, or resources, on Iran, North Korea, Lebanon, Congo, Haiti, and Kosovo. Yet that institution itself is deeply flawed, in part because the United States has not actually vested the energy that's necessary in order to reform it. And so if we really were going to have a State of the Union last night, we would have to say, honestly, I think, that military power and its unilateral use is not adequate to achieve American foreign policy objectives abroad, that the multilateral institutions that we have today are not designed for the kinds of international and transnational challenges we face and have not been renewed in order to deal with that. We are less secure than we were 7 years ago. We are not prepared for the future, and we have in effect squandered the moral authority that we had after September 11th to be able to rally the international community. Now, what the President did spend time on was on the war of terror. And he said it's the decisive ideological struggle of our time. And he said that to win that war, we must take the fight to the enemy. But have we really done that? And I think that the first test of that is a country that was not mentioned for the most part in the speech, and that's Afghanistan. It was seen as the centerpiece of the buildup of transnational terrorism, of the presence of al-Qaeda. And yet, since the Taliban and al-Qaeda have been chased out, the Taliban has started to be resurgent again in the south. Al-Qaeda and the Taliban are resurgent in Pakistan. And as a result of some tremendously courageous reporting by Carlotta Gall of the New York Times, we've seen that in Pakistan there has been, at best, a willingness to tolerate their rise and, in fact, possibly even an abetting of that. If we look at how that mission has been staffed, we can only say that it's radically, radically under-resourced. Between NATO, with 32,000 troops, in the United States, with about 10, there are 42,000 troops or so in Afghanistan. If we were to use the troop-to-population concentration levels that we saw in Bosnia or Kosovo, we would see a mission there on the order of 275,000 to 450,000 troops. Now let's put aside for a second that the geography is different. Let's assume that Afghanistan has some locally developed police and military that can take up part of the cause. At best, this is a mission that is staffed at a quarter to a fifth of what it needs to be to succeed. And what we are seeing in the south of Afghanistan again is that the Taliban is resurgent. The military is coming in, both NATO and the United States, and clearing out areas. And we cannot hold them, and the population is feeling like they have been willing to put their faith in the international community to help. But the next time around, it's going to become much more difficult after the Taliban have come in and reestablished themselves. Now, on Iraq, just a few additional words here. The President has again reiterated that the war in Iraq is essential to fight the war on terror. He did not indicate that originally that this was a battle that was focused on weapons of mass destruction, and in fact that the rise of terror came as a result of the American inability to effectively manage the intervention in Iraq. He did recognize that today it is a Shia-Sunni conflagration. In his words, he said, "It is a tragic escalation of sectarian rage and reprisal," end quote. I think, in other words, a civil war. And it's in the midst of that civil war that we're proposing to put additional troops. The President essentially reiterated the same proposal that he put on the table a week ago and which was roundly rejected by both Republicans and Democrats alike. In effect, when he laid out his goals, he did not actually put aside the term victory. He said, quote, "Our goal is a democratic Iraq that upholds the rule of law, respects the rights of its people, provides them security, and is an ally in the war on terror." It's not a bad goal, but if you look at it from those on the right, the argument has been that we do not have the troops and resources to be able to achieve it. And if you look at the arguments that others have put forward, the president is relying on Iraqis taking a lead, Iraqis who are part of a failed state, where Shiite militias have infiltrated the police, and most of the political leaders on the Shiite side are linked to those militias. And so it's hard to see how we are putting forward a strategy that can actually succeed. There's really very little mention of any kind of regional role in dealing with Iraq or the surrounding issues. The fact that there have been 1.8 million refugees and 100,000 people a month who are being displaced, and somehow there needs to be some kind of dialogue with the countries of the region in order to be to address that. What is also not addressed in the dialogue is the reality that there is a Sunni-Shia split that is extending itself to the region, and where the moderate states of, say, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt may be more willing to support Sunni extremists to win a battle than they would be willing to support an Iraqi government that would be dominated by Shia moderates. So in effect, on Iraq, we heard nothing new and no response to the criticism that has been put forward on the plan from either those who advocate a more aggressive response or those who have said that relying on an Iraqi state, which is essentially a failed state, is not going to work. The final thing I would just say is that the president did, I think, rightly put the war on terror in the context of a generational struggle. And as part of that generational struggle, he called for an increase of 92,000 troops in the Army and in the Marine Corps over a period of 5 years. And he renewed the call for the spread of democracy in the Middle East. And I think it's appropriate to remind people the importance of the power of freedom and what it can mean to individuals, but it is not a short-term strategy. And if you ask the question, did the president help us understand how this can be done, when we have seen in Iraq that certainly democracy cannot be imposed from the outside? Really no tools were put forward. If one would have looked at this realistically, in addition to the 92,000 members of the armed forces that were called for over 5 years, we might have seen for a call of expanding the mere 6,500 foreign service officers that we have around the world to at least a doubling so that we can effectively engage on the ground and understand the developments that we're seeing throughout the world. There was a call for a civilian reserve corps. Interestingly, it's exactly the same civilian reserve corps in which the administration had last year in its budget to kick it off for about $25 million. And I would predict that when you see the budget go up from the administration, there will not even be a budget for it this year, even though it was called for by the president. And so if you bring this back to a historical context and think of what we're facing right now as a generational struggle of our time and compare that to what we saw after World War II, where we had a military buildup, to be sure, but we also had a strategy of containment. The creation of the United Nations, the Bretton Woods Institution, the World Bank, and the IMF to deal with the questions of poverty and financial stability. The creation of NATO and the development of the Marshall Plan. In effect, we had a policy, a strategy, and the developments of institutions to internationalize a process of maintaining global peace and prosperity. And today, what we have is a call to fight them there with an increase of American troops, but no understanding of how we internationalize this process, how we build the institutions to be able to take on this generational struggle. Rightly so, a call for assistance on HIV/AIDS and malaria in particular, but in effect, actually, Pietro, no new money. What was announced was a continuation of the programs that had been pledged before and a request to fund those programs, but not additional money for those programs. Credit should be given for the fact that they were put forward, but we did not see something that is convincingly a call for a strategy to be able to make America more secure, to internationalize the capability to create a greater capacity for peace and security internationally, nor did we see anything that was particularly new on how we can deal with the issues of poverty internationally as well.
Thank you, Carlos. Very interesting discussion of this problem. I'd like to turn quickly to Bill Galston just for a couple of quick comments to pick up on some of what Carlos was touched on. And Bill, here, let me throw this at you. Suppose let's do the following thought experiment. Suppose that we were not in Iraq at all. There was no Iraq war. It was just the war in Afghanistan, and you had the resurgent Taliban as a major problem there. And the president goes before the American people last night and says, we need an increase of up to 200,000 American troops to go into Afghanistan because we only have about a quarter of what we need in there. Would there be a similar outcry about escalation and how we were failing in Afghanistan? Would there be a similar kind of backlash in Congress as you're seeing over Iraq? That's question number one. The other thing I thought I wanted to ask you is if you could also say just a quick word about Senator Jim Webb's reply to the president. Key part in his speech was that basically he would like the president to morph into the equivalent of Dwight D. Eisenhower, and that if he wasn't going to do that, we will be showing him the way, Senator Webb said. Well, give us a sense of what the Democratic Party's way would be in Iraq.
Well, to take your questions in the order posed, the answer to the first one is necessarily speculative. As the Greek philosopher Heraclitus reminded us for all time, it is impossible to step in the same river twice. Having said that, I think the record will show that the war in Afghanistan evoked a broad national consensus. It was seen as essentially defensive in character, made necessary and warranted by a cowardly and unprovoked attack. And if we had only been fighting the war in Afghanistan over the past 5 years, I believe the national conversation would have been entirely better and very different. And the divisions that we're now seeing in the country would not be nearly as pronounced. Having said that, listening to our generals over the past couple of weeks makes me wonder whether we could really mobilize and sustain 200,000 troops to do much of anything under current circumstances. What we're seeing is the consequence of what might be called an asymmetric drawdown of our forces after the end of the Cold War, where the Air Force and the Navy were left more nearly intact than were our ground forces. That was based on an assumption about the nature of the threats that we would face, and unfortunately, in Afghanistan and Iraq, those assumptions have been contradicted by facts on the ground, which is why the president is proposing, as Carlos noted, a major buildup of ground forces on a permanent basis, but no net additions to either the Navy or the Air Force. That is a stark acknowledgement of what should have been clear 3 years ago. I think it's fair to say that we have wasted the better part of 3 years, and we'd be in a better place if the buildup had begun, the buildup of ground forces had begun earlier. With regard to your second question, a few notes about Senator Webb. First of all, he is a talented, experienced writer, and it showed, in the clarity and forcefulness of the language of his speech. I think many people were surprised by the firm, declarative manner of delivery. One commentator went so far as to announce that a star is born. Whether or not that's true, it's clear that a potential leader of the Senate Democrats and perhaps the Democratic Party was born, and that the country had a glimpse of what a narrow majority of the voters of Virginia endorsed in November. And Senator Webb made it very clear that for Democrats, the way forward is the way out. Senator Webb endorsed robust regional diplomacy, as did the Iraq Study Group, a topic conspicuous by its absence in the president's speech last night. Dead silence on the issue of regional diplomacy for reasons that I think are all too clear. Senator Webb repudiated the idea of what he called a precipitate pullout, one that would leave chaos in its wake, but he clearly indicated that in his judgment, which I think is widely shared in the Democratic Party, what we need is a turn of basic orientation towards the assumption that over the next year to 18 months there will be a significant drawdown of American forces. And I would be surprised, frankly, if the majority of the Democratic Party ended up in a different place either this year during congressional debate or next year during the presidential nominating contest.
Great. Thanks, Bill. Let me turn to Dave Sandelow. Dave, lots of questions on the energy front, but let me begin with the climate change question. The good news was that the president finally really mentioned this. He talked about it as a serious challenge. I think the word challenge gets overused in Washington. I wish sometimes people would use the term problem instead of challenge. But anyway, that's the good news. The bad news is it's not clear what exactly is going to be done about it by this administration other than try to reduce gasoline consumption. But as you know better than anybody in this room, gasoline consumption is not the major contributor to carbon emissions. Electric power plants are, especially coal-fired ones. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the climate change question and the fact that so many major CEOs of major corporations came to town just before the president's speech and have basically signed on to a cap-and-trade proposal. And then tell us something about the president's energy proposals. And actually, I might turn to Carlos about an aspect of that, too, as well.
Well, thank you, Pietro. The White House created some great expectations in this speech. Last week, the president's national economic advisor said that the energy proposals in this talk would knock our socks off. And it's now Wednesday morning, and our socks are still on. There was one significant proposal in the energy section of this speech, and that was the proposal for a 35 billion gallon mandate for ethanol production by 2017. That is a significant increase over both current ethanol production, which last year was about 5 billion gallons, and over the current mandate in law, which is 7.5 billion gallons by 2012. It will require substantial increases in the production of ethanol from so-called cellulosic sources, which are switchgrass and other types of and plants and trees, or imports and sugar-based ethanol from Brazil. The limit of corn-based ethanol production in this country, most experts think, is around 15 billion gallons. So the only way to get up to the mandate that the president is talking about is with either this new type of ethanol, which is not cellulosic ethanol, which is not currently commercially viable, or with imports. It's interesting to note in the White House documents talking about this, there is reference to a safety valve related to this mandate and a statement that if the mandate becomes difficult to meet or infeasible, that different cabinet members would have authority to waive the mandate. I think the experience with mandates in general over the course of the past 30 years of U.S. regulatory history is that when businesses come to believe that they will be able to avoid them with negotiations with the government, they invest resources in lobbying to change them instead of meeting them. And so the signaling up front that there is a safety valve in the administration's proposal here significantly undercuts the proposal itself. But with that exception, I think this is a very significant proposal. Nothing else the President said last night in the energy portion of his speech was significant, in my opinion. The 20% cut in gasoline consumption by 10 years will be remembered as long as all the other proposals of a similar nature over the past 30 years. And the Wall Street Journal had a wonderful collection of these last week for anybody who would go take a look. And there have been about a half a dozen by presidents over the course of the past 30 years. If anyone in this room can remember any of them, I'll be impressed. The President is not proposing, as far as we can tell, to incorporate this 20% goal over 10 years into law. It's an aspirational goal by a lame duck president and will not have impact. The CAFE plan that the President proposes, it is essentially what he has already proposed, as far as we can tell. I actually would welcome anybody here who has gotten more information about what the President is actually going to do than is in the documents that we've been able to review so far. But it's clear from the documents what the President is against when it comes to CAFE. And CAFE standards are automotive fuel efficiency standards. The President is against automatic increases on an annual basis, which is one of the proposals that's being put forward by numbers of legislatures. And the President is against specific numeric targets. The President is for extending this to the authority to revise CAFE standards to cars, which is something that he's called for before. The President calls for doubling the Strategic Petroleum Reserve in this speech. I think that would provide a modest additional cushion against supply disruptions. It cost about $35 billion to fill this Strategic Petroleum Reserve at the level the President is calling for. In my opinion, that same money spent on developing plug-in hybrid cars that could connect our vehicle fleet to the electric grid would do much more to protect against supply disruptions than putting more oil into the petroleum reserve. And finally, the President called for and continued to call for drilling in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, which was rejected in the last Congress. It underscores clearly the importance he continues to attach to pleasing his political base. It does not signal a strong interest in bipartisan cooperation. The omissions in this speech are more important than the proposals, and the most important omission is the one that Pietro referred to, and that's the lack of any support for binding limits on greenhouse gases. It's true the President mentioned the words global warming, but in the context of other things going on in this town over the course of the past week, there are a few people who would characterize that as leadership. In the course of the past week, we have had in this town evangelical leaders come to say that global warming is a hugely important issue that must be addressed. And then on Monday, CEOs of 10 of the top businesses in the world, including General Electric, which I believe has the biggest market capitalization of any company in the world, and Walmart, which may have the biggest revenues of any company, both calling, along with 8 other major companies, calling for binding limits on greenhouse gas emissions. The President, there had been some speculation that the President might endorse this or signal some openness to this in the speech. He did nothing of the kind. Surprisingly, also, there were no references to any new proposals on plug-in hybrid vehicles. The President has previously embraced this technology, and it's a technology that has broad bipartisan support. The President did mention plug-in hybrids favorably in the speech, but he didn't call for any new investment. Finally, quickly, there were some confusing references in the speech, and this is hard to do in a talk, but there were some confusing references to gasoline consumption and imports. The President got it wrong. He said, let us reduce gasoline usage in the United States by 20% in the next 10 years, thereby cutting our total imports by an amount equivalent to 3/4 of our imports from the Middle East. If you work out these numbers, he's saying let us cut our gasoline use by about 1.8 million barrels a day, and that will cut our imports by 1.8 million barrels a day. It doesn't work that way. The fact that we are cutting gasoline use in a globalized market for oil does not mean that imports will necessarily fall by that same amount. In fact, they are highly likely not to fall by that same amount, and I'd be happy to elaborate on that in the question and answer session. In terms of I'd say with apologies to Dickens, the President created great expectations, but he delivered a bleak house in the section of his speech on energy. In terms of the expectations that were created by the President's advisors last week, I guess I would grade him a B on ethanol, a C on CAFE, an F on climate change, and an F on domestic oil production.
Those aren't very passing grades, or at least they aren't today. Bill Frenzel, the President actually led off with a plea for what our dear colleague here at Brookings, Isabel Sawhill, calls fiscal sanity, balancing the budget. Were you sort of surprised by that? And do you think there's a any kind of real prospect for bipartisan cooperation on that problem? I also want you to comment, if you would, on the health care part of the proposal, which I thought was the strongest part of the speech and the most compelling.
Yeah, getting to the to the fiscal situation, I think it was a good thing that the President noted that he wanted to set a deficit target. I think it's not a strong enough target. 2012 is not soon enough for me, but it's good to have a target. I think the Democrats, if one can judge by the previous campaign, are interested in deficit reduction. They, of course, have an astoundingly great disparity in priorities. The Democrats will look in one area, principally in, I think, Iraq and the Defense Department appropriations to make reductions. President spoke last night about earmarks, and he will be interested in reducing items that Congress is dearly wanting to keep for itself. But simply the act of talking about deficits on both sides, that is, by the congressional majorities and by the President, I think was a pretty good stroke. Now, I don't know where the cooperation is going to lie. I do not believe that some variation of the Gregg bill, the enhanced precision, which Senator Byrd calls line item veto, is going to be a place where there is going to be agreement. I think, however, the parties may agree on a 2012 target for a balanced budget, but they will, of course, have different paths to glory, and we will have to see how that's going to work out. I would quickly and parenthetically state that I seem to have heard a different message than my co-panelists up here last night. Perhaps their expectations were greater than mine. But I think we have to realize that State of the Union addresses, without a budget to sustain them, are simply a matter of presidents talking about nice things they did before and nice results they hope are going to come along. And I think the way to analyze them, or at least a way I like to use, is to see how the president looks and see how the Congress reacts. And I didn't see any fist fights last night, although I thought Senator Webb was a bit over-aggressive. I thought the decorum in the chamber was fine, so perhaps we came out all right. With respect to that health question, I have to agree it's by far the most interesting item. It is not a new item, but it's new for the President. The President's Advisory Panel on Tax Reform had quite a similar recommendation as part of its tax reform package. It at first blush seems like something that the Democrats' majorities might be interested in, but obviously Big Labor put the stake in its heart right off the bat, and Congress says it's not interested. I think it is something that needs consideration, needs more work, needs budget analysis, but it's not going to go away. I don't think either the Congress or the public is going to tolerate very much longer the public subsidies for Cadillac health plans when money is needed in other places. So I'm not sure Congress is going to embrace this plan But somewhere in here are some kernels of truth and interest that the Congress is going to get to, and we may see some policy definition over the next 2 years.
Thanks, Bill. I thought I'd come back to the other bill for a moment, just a segue from what you were talking about. On the health care proposal, Bill Galston, Charlie Rangel was out of the blocks faster than Jesse Owens on that. On this, this was before the speech. It was when the plan was originally leaked about a week ago, and he said it was bad policy. Pete Stark said it was dead on arrival, and so on. So there's the usual reaction here from the Democrats about this. But what's wrong with the idea of giving a standard deduction on health care plans, discouraging the gold plating of employer-provided health insurance, and leveling the playing field, as the President said, for the self-insured?
Believe it or not, I'm going to answer that question. But before I do, I'd sort of like to step back from that question and ask and answer a question of my own. Namely, this is sort of media management 101, isn't it? When you put the President's speech and Jib Webb's reply together in a package, let's step back and ask, what does that package tell us about where we are? This is before we get to any details of policy, and I would make 4 observations very quickly. First of all, we have, to continue the Dickens theme, a tale of two economies. We have the President's story of the economic aggregates, and we have Jim Webb's story of economic anxiety and inequality. And I confidently predict that that tale of two economies will be argued out not only between the parties, but within the parties. Senator Webb used the classic formulation of Main Street versus Wall Street. You might also put it in more Brookings-pointed terms as populism versus Rubenomics. And I confidently predict that we're going to have a serious debate about economic inequality, about the impact of globalization, about what many Americans' families see as an increasing insecurity in their economic standing, despite a snapshot that may look pretty favorable. General observation number 2. I think we've learned something about the agenda that we're going to be talking about for some years to come. After a hiatus since the mid-1990s, we are going to have a national conversation about health care. We are going to have a national conversation about energy security. We are going to have a national conversation on environmental concerns, even global warming, or to be more neutral, global climate change. Whether we're going to have a national conversation on entitlements is very much in doubt. The President's speech was characterized by near silence on that issue. That, for me, was the single most surprising omission in the President's speech. I thought he would at least empower his Secretary of the Treasury, a laying on of hands that would create the predicate for a serious behind-the-scenes conversation, at least on Social Security. I think the President decided that was, after his 2005 experience, a losing game, and he didn't want to play out his hand. I regret to say that, because I think an opportunity was missed. Here's my third observation. I think we saw in this exchange some new premises for public dialogue being established. The President acknowledged in so many words that the uninsured are a serious problem in the health care system after presiding over a relentless increase through his administration for the first 6 years in the number of Americans who are uninsured and in the percentage of the population that's uninsured. He acknowledged in a remarkable shift from Dick Cheney's 2001 stance that conservation is not just a private virtue, but indeed an important part of energy security. And he uttered words that he cannot take back, quote, the serious challenge of global climate change. To acknowledge the problem is to shape a debate. Fourth point. There are indications, I think unmistakable indications, that during an extended period of policy gridlock in Washington, the basic shape of what might be called the political policy coalitions in the country has been shifting. That's particularly conspicuous in areas such as healthcare and global climate change, where the private sector, which took one position 15 years ago, 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, has now aligned itself squarely with the forces of reform. And my personal prediction is that that new alliance, which includes the private sector, will turn out to be the dominant force in these discussions in 2009, if not earlier. Now, having answered my question, I will now answer yours. I think that the president's health care proposal was a good news, bad news story. The good news is that he acknowledged and named the problem. He put a concrete proposal on the table, and he made it very clear that there is no free lunch strategy for solving the problem. I think that in those three respects, he advanced the debate. What's wrong with the specific proposal? Well, I don't want to tear wings off flies, but here are a few things that I would put on the table. First of all, proposing a deduction rather than a credit is a regressive strategy. I don't see why the advantage you get should be determined by the tax bracket you're in. If anything, I could make an argument for the reverse, and so a tax credit would have been, I think, a much fairer and more appropriate way to proceed. Secondly, a whole lot of people are not paying income taxes at all, and so the deduction offers them no assistance on the income tax front, modest assistance on the payroll tax front, but if you X out the income tax, really not enough to make the difference between affordability and unaffordability. Third, I would note for the record that good health care plans are not necessarily the province of privileged higher income employees in our society. In a number of cases, those good plans are enjoyed by workers who've made sacrifice after sacrifice on the wage front, which brings me to my fourth point. The administration's background briefing paper blithely says, well, if you're disadvantaged by this, you can shift from benefits to wages. Well, that's waving a wand. That's not the way it works. And the way the plan is structured, employers have zero incentive to make that shift because they have zero incentive from going from something they can treat as a business expense to the wage side. Three other points. The way the plan is structured, it gives younger, healthier workers an incentive to opt out of the current plans that they're in and go for cheaper, high-deductible plans. This generates the classic problem of adverse selection in a healthcare risk pool. Here's another problem. The president's background briefing paper announces that as more and more people enter the individual market for health insurance, it will become more competitive and prices will come down. Anybody who knows anything about the way the individual market is currently structured will see that there are a lot of slips between that cup and that lip. I will spare you my personal litany of woe, helping my son enter the individual healthcare market in New York. But anybody who thinks that fixing the individual market is going to be easy is smoking a controlled substance. And finally, And
That
finally,
requires health care, too.
it's actually part of health care if you're a Democrat. And finally, all the president's men and women insist that this policy will be revenue neutral. I don't see how it can be. And it certainly won't be during the next 5 years. And I don't think, and given the fact that the deduction is indexed, which they're very proud of, and rightly so, I don't see how it ever gets to be revenue neutral. I can be talked out of that, but a back-of-the-envelope calculation makes me very dubious. So that's the beginning of an answer to your question of what's wrong with the president's plan, but if you give me another hour, I have much more to say.
No, I won't give you another hour, but I'll give Bill Frenzel 2 minutes to
Thank you.
fight back here if you want to, Bill.
No, I don't want to fight back. I think Bill has raised a number of good points that have to be investigated. But in a lot of ways, Bill, it's fly-specking. People have to work through this program and make it work. Would I rather have a credit than a deduct? Of course. I think that's the right way to do it. That's the way the tax reform panel set it up, and it's better. Is it revenue neutral? How do I know until the CBO pounds out one of its budget analyses? It's counterintuitive to me that it is revenue neutral. It may be back-end loaded. We can't know that now until we see the plan. But I think what's important is the president identified a problem, attacked a corner of it. We're only talking, I think, at his best estimate, 10 million additional people coming into the insurance, into an insured medical plan that they aren't in now. And then he identified a funding source, that is, to reduce the federal subsidies for the so-called Cadillac insurance plan. To me, that's a good way to start. That's what you have State of the Union messages for. And I think this is an area where Congress and the President could work something out. I hope they do. I don't think we have any guarantee of it.
Well, I hope they do, too. And I agree with you, as I said at the outset, that by naming the problem and putting a concrete plan on the agenda, the President has moved the discussion forward. My personal judgment is that as we look at what's going on in the states, this approach has been outrun by events. I think what's going on in the states makes it very clear that a bunch of Republican governors, as well as Democrats, have made the judgment that it's time to stop putting patches on a boiler that's leaking from so many seams, that rather than going through piecemeal reform, it's time to step back and take a fresh look at the entire structure of the health care delivery and insurance system. And I sure hope that as this conversation proceeds at the national level, that judgment is the one that both parties reach sooner rather than later.
Well, we already have one presidential candidate with a ready-made plan.
Yeah, and the President actually did include in his health care component a grant and aid system to the states to try to encourage more experimentation, such as what Massachusetts and California and Vermont and Maine and other states have tried to do. So I think he did recognize that component. We have not touched on immigration at all. That came up again. Bill Frenzel, let me do two things if we have time, because we have about a half an hour left. I would like, if possible, for Bill Frenzel to say just a couple of words on the immigration front. The President went back to what he had proposed earlier, but this time he has a much stronger prospect of getting some help from the Congress. And if you want to say a couple of words on that. And then I'd like to go back to the energy question from a national security and foreign policy standpoint, Carlos, and also, Dave, I hope you'll chime in on that, too.
Okay, just a quick shot on immigration. The President apparently renewed his proposition from last biennium. It is thought that the Democrats would be friendlier to that kind of proposal than the Republicans were, particularly as illustrated by the leadership in the House in the 109th Congress. Everybody who wants to solve the problem is swimming upstream against public opinion. The public is about where the House Republican leadership was last time, really stony on immigration. And while the Democrats' leadership, the new leadership, may be friendlier to the president's proposal, I don't think they're going to be in a hurry to rush out and handle what looks like another one of these third rail kind of problems. I think there is a good possibility to work something out between the president and the Congress along the lines of the Senate bill of last year. But I don't think it's any given. I think the public opinion, which was strongly made known to candidates of all parties in the last election, is a bit of a fright in this case, and I'm not certain that we're going to have any speedy progress on it.
Okay. Carlos, I'm going to throw you a big question, but I hope you can answer it with some brevity, because I'd love to open this up to questions from the audience in a few minutes. Did you sense that there was anything in the President's discussion of the energy issue yesterday, the energy strategy, that will make this country in a genuine, concrete sense more secure? I mean, will it in any way help our national security? To put this another way, help us connect the dots. If energy markets are world markets and there's no domestic energy policy whatsoever that can change that and really insulate us from that fact of life, how, if at all, would the administration's policies make us more secure? Or is this whole notion of energy independence basically a mirage, if you will, sort of like saying, stop the world, we want to get off? Tell us about that.
Well, if we break this down to its most fundamental points, there's a supply side of the market, and how secure is that supply side of the market, and there's a demand side of the market. And if you can actually have a significant impact globally on the demand side of the market, that is at least mitigating the rise for energy demand over time against a limited number of suppliers who can respond to that demand, suppliers that are in themselves, in many cases, in risky situations. I mean, let's think about the countries. Saudi Arabia, Russia, the Caspian Basin, probably the most secure ones. But then we come into the world of Nigeria, Iran, Iraq, Venezuela, Angola, not a particularly stable group or group that one would want to rely upon in order to be able to deal with your energy needs. And so I don't think that the demand question is irrelevant. I think it's an issue that really does have to be looked at, and I defer to my other colleagues, in particular David, on the effectiveness of the strategies that are being proposed. In the short term, one of the issues that really did not get touched upon, even though the President did, I think, a fairly good job of describing some of the potential regional consequences of the civil war in Iraq, is the energy dimension. And there is very likely to be a speculative impact of what instability and an increased spillage of civil war can do to potential disruptions of energy supplies. It could have an impact on oil prices. If there is any disruption on oil supplies, I think that will have a massive impact on energy prices. If there is any indication of disruptions in the Persian Gulf, that will also be extremely destabilizing. And it's going to create a lot of anxieties within the international community. And I think this is one of the reasons why it's also particularly important in having a regional dialogue in the Gulf, including countries such as Turkey, including the United Nations and the EU, because these are issues that have a global dimension to them. It's not just a question that is going to have an immediate impact on the region. It's going to affect us back here. It's going to affect the principal consumers of energy around the world. So I really don't think that these issues have really been adequately explored, and they're extraordinarily complex questions that are really going to have to occupy our attention.
Right, but yeah, David, I wanted you to come back on this. You know, in terms of, okay, suppose there is a major disruption. Our main line of defense against that is the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, which the President wants to increase by twofold, I think, right, over a period of time. You seem to think that that was not a wise strategy to beef up the SPR, but it really is the only short-term way to offset a shortfall in world energy in world oil supplies and take the sting out of a big price spike.
I think it is trivial in the context of our larger energy problems. That's my major point. The increment in the Strategic Petroleum Reserve that's proposed is, I think, somewhere between 30 and 60 extra days of coverage against all imports. And I guess what that means is that if Saudi Arabia, Canada, and Mexico simultaneously have jihadist revolutions, will be covered for an extra 30 or 60 days. And in all seriousness, it does not address the core issue, which is the exposure of U.S. oil purchasers to the volatility in the global market for oil. And in my view, and I think the view of most experts, the only way to protect against that volatility is to change our transportation infrastructure so that we are less dependent on oil overall. As long as we remain dependent on oil exclusively with our cars, we will be subject to price swings in the global oil market. And just think about it quickly. I mean, if you're thirsty and you don't feel like drinking water, you can drink Coke or milk. If you want to relax and you don't want to watch TV, you go to a movie or read a book. If you want to go someplace today and you don't want to use oil, you are probably out of luck. I mean, you know, maybe you can bike someplace if you're not going too far, or walk. Maybe you can buy ethanol at, you know, about 1% of the stations in the country that have E85 gas. But oil is the one good we absolutely depend upon, and until we change that, we're going to be subject to this price volatility. We can do that, I believe, with plug-in hybrid cars. And if you want to know more about this, I recommend two things you could read. One of them is a paper I wrote on this topic, which is out back, which you could get. A second is a wonderful editorial on this topic by the Washington Post. The lead editorial in Sunday's paper has a very good summary of this set of issues. And I think, I mean, Carlos hit this, you know, nail on the head with his points here too. Can I make one point on global warming before
Absolutely,
you
sure.
Right. Pietro, both you and Bill were somewhat encouraged by what the President had to say about global warming, and I tend to like to see the glass half full. So you caused me to wonder why I am not encouraged, and you got me thinking, which is dangerous. And I guess the reason that I am not tremendously encouraged by the few words on global warming I heard in the State of the Union is that what matters now is on global warming is what President Bush does, not what he says. His global warming policy is almost as unpopular as his Iraq policy. It's not that even the Republican Party is looking to him for leadership on the global warming issue. Even his new political bosom buddy, John McCain, is in a completely different place than George Bush is on global warming. John McCain, who of course is in most people's eyes the front runner for the Republican presidential nomination, is the co-sponsor of the leading global warming bill for the past couple of years in the U.S. Senate. So George Bush is hardly a thought leader in any quarter on global warming these days. And even the CEOs who came to town to make this announcement didn't even connect with the White House particularly in doing this. And then there's a history of George Bush saying things on this issue that he then doesn't do. In the 2000 campaign, he promised he would be for binding limits for carbon dioxide and then backed away from that. So I think it matters a lot because he is president and because he holds a veto pen. It matters a lot what George Bush is willing to sign by way of global warming legislation. I just don't think that words about whether or not it's a challenge from him are that significant at this point.
Great. Thanks very much, guys. Let's take questions. Yes.
Scott Harrell, Brookings. Three very quick questions. David, we didn't hear anything about nuclear energy. Should we have, and if we should have heard something, what should we have heard? Bill, really liked your framing of the two speeches together. I wonder if you think the average audience member saw those two together and thought, oh, this one did a better job, this one did a less well job, and where that leaves the two parties going into '08. And for Carlos, a bit more in depth, we heard a lot about Iran again. The president went into some great depth about Sunni extremists, Shia extremists, and made a lot of reference to how we're going to be trying to deter Iran and possibly also Syria. Do you think, I was watching it in Georgetown last night in a bar with a lot of younger people. A lot of them seem to think that this was a call for further action against Iran, possibly even war. I wonder if your take is that this is more rhetoric, or is this something that is a hint as to where the president plans to take us in the future?
Just quickly on nuclear, I think the president may have made passing reference to nuclear in the address or in the fact sheets, and his administration has been very strong supporters of nuclear power, and I don't think this address intended to signal any change in that. This is a technology that is obviously deeply controversial. Neither on Wall Street nor on Main Street can you find much support for nuclear power. There has been growing interest in some parts of the utility sector in a new generation of nuclear plants. A small amount of interest in the environmental community as a result of the potential savings in heat-trapping gases, but I think it still remains a very deeply controversial technology.
Well,
Just one other point is,
Yeah, sure.
by the way, is that you should have directed this question to Pietro, who actually knows much more about this than I do, or others, on this panel.
All I know is that nuclear power is extremely expensive, much more expensive than coal, and therefore not competitive, without significant government subsidies.
He's written a wonderful paper on that topic, which I commend you.
With regard to the impact of the two speeches just as events, I'm going to make a reckless prediction. I have seen no morning after surveys. Two things would surprise me. Number one, I would be surprised if there were a huge surge of public sentiment towards the president on the basis of that speech. It was a workmanlike speech, I think delivered with some energy, but did it have what the late President Nixon once called the lift of a driving dream? No, I don't think so. Those driving dreams are in the past and seem to have driven us into a ditch. With regard to Senator Webb's speech, I'd love to know how many Americans stayed up to watch it. Clearly the junkies, I assume everybody in this room falls into that category, did so. But I think that I think that the speech will have more of an impact on what the political version of the secondary market, the reverb, the replay, the chatter, etc. And I do think in Democratic circles, at the grassroots level as well as in Washington, his stock has risen significantly as a result.
On the question of Iran and Syria, the Sunni and Shiite conflagration, one of the things I think the president did make an effort to go after is try to explain some of the complexity which we're seeing in front of us, because on one hand he was trying to lay out that al-Qaeda has a Sunni base, that they are Sunni extremists. And what we see in Iraq increasingly are Shiite extremists who may be getting some support from Iran, but indeed also have an indigenous base of support. And this is not a very clear picture of being on one side of Sunnis or Shias, that in fact we've got bad guys on both sides of the equation here. I personally actually felt that the president talked less about Iran than I might have expected him to. I thought he talked about it a little bit less than he did last time. One of the things that we have seen is that the U.S. military, I think, somewhat publicly, but certainly internally, has been emphasizing that venturing across the border into Iran is probably not a very good step to take. There's certainly been wide political condemnation. I think within the President's own team, a great number of his political strategists are indicating that this is not a direction to take, although I'm sure that there are some hardliners who are leaving that open as an option. There has been a very negative reaction to the President's Iraq speech by the Congress, saying that we are putting down markers here that we do not want to see any cross-border activities into Iran or Syria. And so I frankly would not expect that the United States would take action into Iran and Syria. But there is another issue here that needs, I think, important attention. Iran, in the meantime, continues to develop its nuclear program. And it has defied, I think, a quite extensive diplomatic effort by the administration, the EU, and most of the P5, although Russia and China have not necessarily been as helpful as they may have been. And one of the risks that continues is that some will continue to point to Iran and say, look, we've tried the diplomatic route, and what has it gotten us? We have an Iran which continues to develop a nuclear program, an Iran that continues to be active in its support for Hezbollah and Hamas, an Iran which is active still in support for Shiite extremists internally within Iraq, and an Iran that certainly would love to see the United States withdraw from the region. I think it's going to be an extraordinarily tricky issue to continue to manage, and one of the challenges for the administration will be to find ways to resuscitate or revive the diplomatic process around Iran. There's been some ability to maintain the P5 together. There's been some criticism that the United States has been too willing to accommodate compromises to keep Russia and China in the game. But I think the administration on this issue deserves a lot of credit, that by keeping the P5 together to some extent, by sustaining some form of unity, even though it doesn't demonstrate the kind of impact one would ideally would have seen, that we are in a better situation than if the diplomatic process had fallen apart completely. I think a real challenge is for Russia and China, if they are willing to step up and acknowledge some of the difficulties that they are creating by being unwilling to demonstrate to Iran that there is a real international security risk, and that this threatens to blow apart even further the non-proliferation regime that we've had in the past. And Russia certainly has an interest in being concerned about that, and Russia can be part of the solution. So if there were a time for Russia to step up to the plate diplomatically and reinforce its rhetoric that it is important to have a multilateral system that works, this is an area where Russia can actually make a difference and play a constructive role.
Quick clarification of my comment in answer to your question about nuclear power, Scott. What I meant to say is that building nuclear plants is a lot more expensive than building coal-fired or gas-fired plants. Once you've built the plants, then nuclear energy is highly competitive. Question in the back, way in the back there.
I'd like to ask a question about health policy. In California, the governor's program costs $12 billion, and he wants $5.5 billion from the federal government. The governors of Pennsylvania and Ohio are going to come to Washington asking for a lot of Medi-Cal money for their health reform programs. A, will it be forthcoming from Congress and the President, especially under the Democratic pay-go rules? And does this mean that what is billed as health reform in the states really requires a huge increment of new federal spending?
Bill Frenzel?
Yeah, I would say it undoubtedly does. One of our presidential candidates has just done some kind of reform up in Massachusetts, and what you have and other speakers here have mentioned the California experiment. All of them seem to rely very heavily on federal dollars. The new Democratic majorities, after years of bellyaching about pay-go budget rules, now may be hoist on their own petard. I don't think there's going to be a lot of money to send out into the states for new programs and new coverages. My guess is that those majorities are going to have particular priorities of their own, education being one, child health being another. That if there is money left over, they're going to work on it now and devote it to those priorities. It is true, however, that they can waive the pay-go rules. And over the life of the Budget Act, or over the life of the pay-go program, which originated in the Budget Enforcement Act of 1990, and prior restraints such as Graham-Rudman, when anything began to bother the Congress, it would simply waive the pay-go or invent an emergency or do something else. I could see the new majorities doing that on occasion. I hope they won't. But I wouldn't see them doing it for the states simply to distribute money to other political subdivisions where the Congress doesn't really have a strong motivation to be helpful. So I would guess that they would ask for these monies mostly in vain.
Good afternoon, John Avery from John Glenn Institute. I have a quick question about health care for the panel. It's been brought up recently, the idea of negotiating with drug companies for name brand prescription drugs, and they are accounting for a large chunk of healthcare costs in America. None of that was mentioned last night. Do you think they're trying to just avoid it, or is that actually a viable solution that you guys would believe in?
Bill, I know you have in the past believed in it. I don't know where you stand now, but
Look, the Democrats have been anything but silent on the question. It was an important element of the initial package of 8 items that made its way through the House of Representatives in well under 100 legislative hours. Its fate in the Senate is unknown for all sorts of reasons. Clearly, the administration went to the mat back in 2003 to prevent any such power being placed in the hands of the federal government, and I am certain that if such a bill did make its way to the president's desk, he would veto it. It'll be a long time, if ever, before we get to find out whether it will make a difference or not. Sort of speculating forward, you can make all sorts of complicated arguments to the effect that it would make a difference, and all sorts of complicated arguments to the effect that it wouldn't. My own view is that it probably would, but probably less than many enthusiastic Democrats in the House of Representatives believe, and therefore, like all of the other incremental steps that we've been talking about, would represent just one more patch on the proverbial leaky boiler. And so my hope, to repeat, is that we get beyond discussions like that and move straight to the kinds of discussions that governors of both parties are now instigating and catalyzing in their respective states, because I'm convinced that only by putting everything on the table at the same time can we possibly arrive at a reasonable resolution of these issues that might be viable across party lines.
What are some of the solutions you're seeing from the governors that are working in their respective states of California or Pennsylvania?
Well, it's much too early to tell because to the best of my knowledge, of the ones that have been listed this morning, only the Massachusetts plan has been enacted into law, and because of the detailed regulatory implementation process is not yet effective. Governor Schwarzenegger's proposal is a proposal. Governor Rendell's proposal is a proposal. Stay tuned. If you're asking my personal opinion, it is that universal coverage consistent with the basic framework of private health insurance that we have in this country is going to include elements such as an individual mandate, which is one of the basic building blocks in Massachusetts, and such as means-tested financial assistance to low and moderate income families for the purchase of policies. I could go on, but I think those two elements at a minimum will be essential to any solution.
Thank you.
This gentleman right here.
Thomas Nowotny, Austria. What I was struck by the speech, as it was so very much centered on the United States and had such a total disregard on the international environment. The United States are active. 2 points. If you ask me, from my point, what the most serious problem for the United States is the current account deficit, which has become structural and cannot be remedied either by balancing the federal budget or by devaluing the dollar. This is a very, very serious challenge to the United States. The second thing is the energy question. When we had an energy problem the first time in the 70s, Kissinger was in charge of things, and he created the International Energy Agency in Paris as a kind of an international response of the OECD, of wealthy countries, to that crisis. The problem at present, for instance, is not only just the relatively high consumption in the United States, it's the fast, rapidly rising consumption, for instance, in China and India. And so all those things, I think they need the international response. And I was struck that Doha Round was not mentioned. The question of the current account deficit was mentioned, and in the question of energy, the international picture was completely left out. Thank you.
Anybody want to take a crack at that?
I mean, I can just comment on a couple of things. I think your observation is exactly right. And the speech is one that was not really put in a broader international context and was put very much in an American context. And one of the things which was quite striking was the solutions that were posed to those problems, even though they're seen as problems particularly affecting the United States, the war on terror in Iraq, were very much American solutions rather than actually looking at what it is in the international community that we need to do to restructure an international and a multilateral security system to actually make us safer. On the energy front, you're absolutely right to point out the importance of China and India in the overall equation. In fact, yesterday we had here at Brookings an event that focused on energy issues in 4 countries, China, India, Russia, and Japan, as the beginning of an energy security initiative that we're beginning here at Brookings. With China and India, the good part of the story is that they're growing. They're growing tremendously. And it's better to have a China and India that are growing rapidly and are starting to respond to the needs of their people. The question that it also provokes is, in what way, driven by what energy sources, right now, particularly coal, the environmental impacts that has had, and in the importance of transitioning off of coal, and as they've been doing that, the increased pressure that they've been putting on international oil and gas markets. And those are realities that have to be taken into account. And the other side of the story is that neither China nor India are part of the International Energy Association. And the significance of that is that if the IEA is essentially the body that sets the rules for how the international energy market is supposed to work, neither of these 2 countries are either participating in setting the rules or abiding by the rules, which is not good for either producers or consumers internationally. The one other point that I would just sort of note on the side related to the current account deficit is with China.
Sure.
Which in fact holds $1 trillion of American debt. And if we're looking at trade issues with China, if we're looking at exchange rate management issues with China, with a country in which we have become essentially dependent on financing the American deficit, where the interest rates of ordinary Americans are dependent on China's willingness to continue to buy the level and the rate of debt that they have been willing to in the past, it has inevitably an impact on that bilateral relationship, and it's one that we have to take seriously into account for the long term.
Just a quick comment, and then I'm going to turn it over to Bill. The problem with the current account deficit, on the one hand, and of energy consumption in China, vast growing economies like China and India on the other, actually cut in opposite ways, because The bad news is that China and India are consuming a lot more fossil fuel and spewing out a great deal more carbon into the atmosphere. But the good news is that their growth, this energy consumption fuels their growth, could eventually be one of the forces that helps bring down our trade deficit. Bill?
Well, I want to thank you for asking your question because I think it's a very important leading indicator for the future, not just of the United States. Unilateralism is more than a policy; it's a way of thinking. And the Yale historian John Lewis Gaddis points out that the kind of internationalism that characterized American foreign policy and American thinking after World War II is a conspicuous exception to the main current of American history, and that the Bush administration, rather than being exceptional, represents a kind of reversion to the historical default position of American foreign policy. In my judgment, it is going to be a great struggle for our political system to restore a balance that tilts more towards the internationalism that characterized the post-World War II period. In my judgment, nothing is more necessary. It's also the case that few things will be harder. The hope, the basis for hope is that the American people themselves appear to believe, if public opinion polls are to be trusted, that our country has paid an enormous price internationally for its unilateralist turn, and Americans like to be liked, which is not always a vice. And the American people are very uncomfortable with the current situation in which we are neither liked nor respected, as Carlos pointed out, in so many nations around the world, including our historic post-World War II allies. But I can tell you that there will be a significant debate within the Democratic Party, and I suspect within the Republican Party as well, as to how much we should reverse the current stance and move back towards the internationalism of the post-World War II period. Stay tuned.
We have time for one or possibly two questions, depending on how pithy we can be up here at the front. Yes.
Hi, this is Abir Kaid from France, Ontario University. I have a question for Mr. Carlos. After September 11, we saw Mr. Bush has declared a war against Islam and especially Saudi Arabia. And he is supported also by all the American media. And today, as you mentioned, you said we would like to Saudi Arabia and other countries like Jordan to involve and to help get the stability again in this in Iraq. So how we call them Wahhabis, and I guess a few people know what does it mean, or who is Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, and how we want them to be more involved in this war, and they never been consulted in this war or any Arabic countries. So this is my question. And second, I would like to talk just about the economic situation, just between practice. United States pay today for Arabic translation $1,400 a year. So my question is, what do you expect from Arabic country to do, and especially Saudi Arabia?
Well, I think, first of all, after September 11th, I don't think President Bush, to be fair, declared a war on Islam or on Saudi Arabia, but he declared a war on terror. There have been statements that have been made by the president, such as Islamofascists, or phrases that have been used that have, I think, unfortunately created a characterization or a perception that the United States is at war against Islam. And I think if the President were here on the stage today and he were asked, is the United States at war against Islam, that he would say no. And I think it would be a huge mistake if that perception were perpetuated. The United States isn't at war against Islam and shouldn't be at war against Islam. The question then comes back to the issue of strategy. If the American strategy in fighting the war against terror is principally focused on a military response, then that is going to have certain complications. I think we need to put this issue in the context of understanding or differentiating among Islam, extremist Islam, and terrorism, all of which are three different things. And if your response to all three of those is really a focus, a military focus on the war against terror, and that comes to dominate your international perception, then there's a real possibility that those who are Islamists, those who are extremists, can actually be pushed further into the camp of being terrorists, and that's one of the dangers that we face today. And so as we look at the response in the war against terror, it's going to be important for us to recognize that there are other dimensions, that there has to be a stronger diplomatic dimension. And while the President talked about reinforcing diplomacy, there were really no additional tools that were put in that diplomatic toolkit. There was no call for additional diplomats, no call for additional resources to those diplomats. The call for a civilian reserve, if it's created, would be something that could be created over a period of about 5 years, and it might result in a reserve of things like police and police trainers that could be brought into conflict zones. But that's not the solution to this issue either. And so there's a huge gap there, I think, still in American policy on how we deal internationally with the questions of Islam and extremist Islam, how we understand it, how we develop strategies that are localized. In a recent article by George Packer in the New Yorker, citing work that was done by David Kilcullen, an Australian, he emphasizes the point that you can't actually aggregate this issue. You have to break it down. You have to break it down into local situations and understand what the problems and the grievances are at that local level, and then respond to those problems and grievances at that local level. And the reality is that we don't have the capacity, the people, the skills, the tools to do that today. And that's where I think one of the biggest problems lies.
Okay, one last question. The lady here in front.
Thanks. I'm Peggy Orchowski. I'm the congressional correspondent for Hispanic Outlook magazine, and I write a lot about immigration and writing a book about it, actually. And I'd like to ask a question about immigration. I'm sorry Ms. Sanger isn't here, but the President spent exactly 1 minute and 57 seconds talking about immigration last night. He suggested his one main proposal was on temporary expansion of temporary visas, which most Democrats hate. Charles Rangels calls temporary visas the closest thing to slavery since we've had since the 18th century. Bush also never mentioned one of the biggest factors that Democrats push, which is the legalization of illegal immigrants in the country. He only said the problem should be resolved. He didn't even use the buzzword pathway to citizenship. Obviously, the speech was not an open gate to bipartisan legislation for, or at least a Bush Democratic legislation for immigration. So my question is, do you think after this speech that this mantra that immigration is the one issue that Democrats and Republicans, well, mainly Bush, will be able to push this year, will continue to be determined in the 110th Congress?
If I may put in my 2 cents on that question. I think the answer to your final challenge continues to be yes. My hunch, and here I associate myself with my fellow Bill, on this panel, is that if something like the Kennedy-McCain Senate bill is, in effect, the markup vehicle for the 110th Congress, and if something comes out of that process that is within hailing distance of where the Senate ended up in the 109th Congress, I believe that large numbers of Democrats in both houses would find a way to support that bill, and I believe the President of the United States would happily sign it. And if I'm not misjudging the situation, both political parties have an incentive to get this issue off the table before the 2008 presidential election. Having said that, to get a rise out of my fellow Bill, I will say that I don't entirely agree with his political assessment. As I looked at the November election, a lot of Republicans who took extreme, harsh, negative stances on immigration got whacked by their constituents. And that was particularly true in Arizona. I do not detect a groundswell of public animosity, and I think that when when the president used the phrase last night, without animosity and without amnesty, to characterize in broad terms the outlines of a possible solution to the legal status of those currently in this country, he hit, at least emotionally, a sweet spot, because I think that's where the American people are. They don't want to be harsh and punitive, nor do they simply want to reward law breaking. And there are ways, and I think the Senate bill pointed toward them, of squaring that circle. So I remain optimistic. I would be very surprised, frankly, if the two parties did not find their way to a solution of this issue.
I feel the same way, and I would be overjoyed to be wrong in my estimate of the public opinion.
Thank you so much for coming, and we'll see you next year.